Who remembers the American Independent Party and George Wallace? Being that we are in another presidential election year that looks as if it is going to be quite interesting after years of lackluster candidates, I am reminded of the campaign of 1968. I was 13 years old and I had never seen a real third party making significant inroads before. It was the American Independent Party, and its candidate was the controversial governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace. Before I get into the election, let me tell you a little about two campaign tokens that you are seeing as I present this to you. The first is an aluminum token with Wallace on the obverse and the words George C. Wallace, governor of Alabama, and on the reverse features the state coat of arms, if you will, with the words Alabama, a state with a great future. The second is gold toned, but I think it's also aluminum. The obverse has a profile of George C. Wallace and has his name along with Alabama's fighting governor, and on the reverse a flying bald eagle and the words, "Let the people speak, stand up for America." His campaign was fueled by race issues of the day, and those issues were intense, even in Saginaw. There had been racial violence. I lived in Bridgeport, about 5 miles outside of Saginaw, and those of us who walked to school were warned to be very careful of carloads of blacks coming from the city to cause problems. But as far as I recall, that never happened. And I remember going to Saginaw Fair in 1968 when it was still downtown. There were lots of distractions, and Mom and Dad watched me like a hawk. There were people from all the three political parties handing out flyers and pins promoting their candidate, and I liked Wallace and gathered up as much of the campaign materials as I could. I think as a 13-year-old who saw the racial movement as terroristic is why I thought Wallace was awesome. But a little background of this interesting political entity. George Wallace was the 45th governor of Alabama. He was the third longest gubernatorial tenure in post-constitutional United States history at 16 years and 4 days. He was a presidential candidate in 4 consecutive elections in which he sought the Democratic Party nomination in 1964, 1972, and 1976, and was the American Independent candidate in the 1968 election. He remains the last third-party candidate to receive any state's electoral votes. An attempted assassination attempt left Wallace paralyzed in 1972, and he used a wheelchair the rest of his life. He strongly supported segregation, but curiously he later renounced it. When he took the oath of office on January 14, 1963, standing on the gold star marking the spot where nearly 102 years earlier Jefferson Davis was sworn in as provisional president of the Confederate States of America. In his inaugural address, Wallace said, and I quote, "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever," end quote. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy's administration ordered the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Division from Fort Benning, Georgia, to be prepared to enforce the racial integration of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. In a vain attempt to halt the enrollment of black students Vivian Malone and James Hood, Governor Wallace stood in front of the Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama on June 11, 1963. This became known as the stand in the schoolhouse door. In 1963, Wallace attempted to stop 4 black students from enrolling in elementary schools in Huntsville. After intervention by federal court in Birmingham, the 4 children were allowed to enter on September 9th, becoming the first integrated primary or secondary school in Alabama. So much more could be written and said, but suffice it to say that it was a dramatic era in the United States history. When people think of the racial violence of the 1960s. They think of the big cities like Detroit or Birmingham, Alabama, where there was great violence sometimes. But the violence extended even up here to Saginaw, Michigan. My grandma lived on, I think it was 4th Street, right downtown. And I remember Dad getting so mad at her because the gunshots would start to ring out. And she would go right out on the porch and right out on the street to see what was going on. It was a very dangerous thing for her to do, and a dangerous time in American history, a dangerous time in Michigan history. And whether he was right or wrong, Governor Wallace held to his views until later in his life, when again he renounced segregation, and he also accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. Well, whilst you're here, why not take a half second and tick on the subscribe button so that you don't miss a single new program here on the Dennis Morrison channel. Have a great evening, and God bless.